Evening, everyone. Strange, eerie silence in the last couple of minutes. Hard to know who's out there, who's not out there, but welcome. Let's go for another week when we this evening look at the British Empire, global power, and imperial angst. And if you cast your mind back to last November, towards the end of November, Barbados became a republic. It became a republic with an elected president. Queen Elizabeth, no longer the head of state. And they had a Trafalgar Square in the middle of the capital city, which had a name change, and a large statue of Lord Nelson was removed. It must be said it was not removed. It was removed rather ceremoniously, with a ceremony of state almost, but it was removed. And Barbados was only one place that experienced colonization and was one of the worst places where you had slavery. There is a very interesting book by Sean O'Callaghan, this book, To Hell or Barbados. You may remember Cromwell's famous expression, to hell or Connaught. Well, apparently also at the same time, there was another expression as well known, to hell or Barbados. And between 1652 and 1659, this book covers the story. Some 50,000 Irish men, women, and children were transported to Barbados and to Virginia. And many of them became slaves. Some indentured, others were not. And there was a great deal of suffering, as there was suffering for all who were in slavery. So Barbados got this independence at the end of November, towards the end of last year. Now, of course, again, we've looked at this before. Who writes history? History tends to be written by the winners, by those who dominate, by those who are or were in power. And the European empires, all 7 of them, wrote their own histories, telling what we might describe as a thine be the kingdom, the power, and the glory kind of story. But in the last 10, 15 years at least, history is now being written from below. The narratives have been broadened as not before, and history is what hurts. And alongside the narratives told by the empires, we now have the narratives of those who suffered from the empires. We now are beginning to hear and to read and to understand the histories that hurt. So we need to look briefly at Britain's global expansion. And we go back to the very early 17th century, 1603. The Union of Crowns brought together the kingdoms of England and Scotland and Ireland under King James VI of Scotland, who then became James I of England. We are familiar with James I of England. He is the James of the King James Bible, or the Authorized Version. He is the James also who drew up the Articles of Plantation for Ulster, very carefully drawing up a set of articles that would seek to control this troublesome place, which it was proving to be troublesome to government in London. And James drew up Articles of Plantation to subdue this troublesome place, but also, the article stated, to turn this last kind of bastion of Gaelic independence, which it was, but also to turn its population to the true faith and true religion, which he claimed was Protestantism and not the terrible Catholicism. And around the same time as as settlers were coming here, mainly from Scotland, but also some from England and some from Wales, around the same time, the first settlers were arriving in Virginia on the other side of the Atlantic, and beginning to arrive on these Caribbean islands. And a place like Jamaica was seized at this stage from the Spanish. Of course, cash crops were there of tobacco and sugar, and they became important. They became very important. But the settlers there were not enough settlers to work these tobacco and sugar plantations. And so slaves were brought in from Africa. Slaves from Africa were acquired on those plantations, and that is where their slave labor took place under very difficult and harsh conditions. Now, at this time, as empires are beginning to push out and expand and claim more and more territory, there is a religious dimension to empires. We need to remember that this is the era of Christendom, that era when church and state are one, when faith and politics are one, where it is difficult to separate the two out. There is no great dividing line between them. And there was a religious dimension to the empires because you had, and a sectarian dimension, we might say, to what was going on in terms of expansionism. Because you had Protestant Britain and the Protestant Netherlands pushing for global dominance against Catholic Spain, Catholic Portugal, and Catholic France. So this religious dimension is alive and well at this time. But the British Empire, like these other empires, is now going global. It takes back Quebec from the French, and Canada becomes a British colony, and there are now 13 colonies in North America. When they try to sell some of these colonies tea from China, for example, there is revolt, if you like, in Boston, and the Boston Tea Party takes place. The Boston Tea Party, with its famous phrase, no taxation without representation, and this leads to resistance, and to growing resistance to British imperialism. And so by 1776, those who were colonized won a victory over the British Empire, and they created the United States of America. Key players in that independence struggle and key players in the Declaration of Independence were the Scots-Irish. We remember at this time that well, at least we do need to remember that America is born, the USA is born in resistance to the British Empire of the day and gaining its independence from that empire. Meanwhile, elsewhere on the planet, Captain Cook has raised the flag in Australia, and the first prisoners begin to arrive in Botany Bay in 1788. And eventually the city we know today as Sydney was built there. We've looked at this before from the 1880s. From 1881, European powers began their scramble for Africa. South Africa, Kenya, Nigeria, Rhodesia became key British settlements. Rhodesia named after Cecil Rhodes. British settlers in South Africa encountered the Boers, who were earlier Dutch settlers. That meant conflict that led to war, that led to the Boer War of 1889-1902. Britain lost many of its soldiers in that war, 29,000. It won the battles, but in many ways it lost the war. And it was at this time and during that war that the British became the first people to invent concentration camps, in which 160,000, mainly women and children, were interned at that time, and many of them died. At the same time as the war was fought and the war ended, memorials were set up in Britain to Boer War martyrs, as they were referred to. But the history and the interpretation of history on many of those memorials was far from the truth. It was propaganda for the people back in the metropolis, if you like. But many began to see through that and were not at all fooled by the propaganda on war memorials. By 1911, King George V is not only king, but he is king emperor. And he's the only reigning king emperor to visit India. He visits India, is there for quite some time. There are some difficult moments, maybe many difficult moments, but incredibly, only 3 years after King George had gone to India, the world was engulfed in an imperial war. And that imperial war was world war in the sense that the European imperial powers involved in it involved soldiers and recruited soldiers from their colonies in different parts of the world, and many Indian soldiers came and fought within and beside the British soldiers in World War I. And many of those who came not only to the British side in the war, but to other powers as well, French and Germans. They were not, those who came from elsewhere were not recognized. There was a very strong racist element to militarism. And indeed, after the war, soldiers from India, from Africa, were not allowed to take part in victory processions in London. But we need then to look at the empire and India, because this was a big part of it, and this was key. The British East India Company had arrived in India in the 17th century. Now, this was a trading company, and they saw possibilities in India. They arrived in India. They began to build, in a sense, for themselves an empire. But from the Battle of Plassey in 1757, which was led by Robert Clive, Bengal was conquered, which brought 20 million new subjects into the British Empire and brought in £3 million at the time for the British Empire. The East India Company dominated India until what the British described as the Indian Mutiny of 1857. A serious mutiny broke out in that year. Burma was annexed to the empire in 1852, and the 1857 mutiny was such a serious fright, if you like, to empire, that the British Empire itself, the British establishment, governing establishment, took over India from the East India Company after 1857. There were outbreaks of violence at this time, terrible brutality from both British and Indians, but the British, above all, seemed to indulge in an orgy of murder and looting and rape, which newspapers were loath to report at home. Such were the levels of violence. But what happened in 1857 was not a bid for Indian independence as such, but it set the direction for Indian people and independence. A road was taken from 1857 that would end 100 years later, or at least nearly 100 years later, in 1947 in independence. But crucial along the way was what happened in Amritsar on the 10th of April 1919. Again, there had been violent conflict. Again, you have incidents taking place where there is resistance to empire. You have Brigadier General Reginald Dyer responding, coming into Amritsar on the 10th of April 1919. It's an important Sikh religious festival, and 50,000 Sikhs have gathered in an enclosed area in Amritsar, and 50,000 people in that enclosed area with only 2 gates in or out are now trapped. Dyer has marched in, basically a handful of soldiers, not many, but he has brought his soldiers in, and he ordered his soldiers to open fire and keep firing until your ammunition is exhausted. Well, the 50,000 Sikhs had nowhere to go. The British figures given for the dead, 379. Indian figures, 1,499. Dyer was fully supported by the British governor of the Punjab. That was the territory in which this took place. And the British governor of the Punjab, Sir Francis Michael O'Dwyer, gave his full support to Brigadier General Reginald Dyer. Now, something we've got to come back to, not tonight, but we will next week, and look more closely at the reality that Dyer and O'Dwyer were Irish. And we need to come to terms with that one, and what their role was, a significant role, if you like, for the British Empire in this particular big turning point of Amritsar on the 10th of April 1919, because the Amritsar massacre was a turning point, and after that, independence was inevitable. The road to independence had now been taken, and so we move forward, and Viscount Mountbatten arrived on the 22nd of March 1947 in India. He's the last viceroy. He arrives to be the last viceroy. And on the 24th of March, 2 days after arrival, there is what could only be described as a huge enthronement ceremony on two huge thrones, with everybody dressed in all sorts of military and ceremonial dress. Mountbatten tended to like that kind of thing, but he was here. This was almost a coronation, and he's here to oversee India's independence. Well, by October, Delhi was torn by riots. Other places followed. Mountbatten suddenly reduced the timetable for independence, shortened it, too short, in fact, probably. Very quickly, a barrister, Sir Cyril Radcliffe, was flown from London to draw up the borders of a partitioned India, because that was the direction in which India was now seemingly heading. So by the 14th of July 1947, you have Independence Day for a new country, Pakistan. And on the 15th of August, you have Independence Day for India. And Pakistan is East Pakistan, it's West Pakistan, and it's divided because somewhere in between the two bits of Pakistan, you have Kashmir. And Kashmir is still a hotly disputed territory over which Pakistan and India have, with some frequency, clashed and gone to war and violence. The partition and the independence was a disaster in many ways. 1 million Muslims were massacred. Hindus, Sikhs, and Muslims killed each other. Thousands of women were raped. Partition, rather than a federal solution, and a federal solution was a possibility, as a federal solution was a possibility in Ireland in 1920. But partition, rather than some kind of federal solution in India, was chosen as the answer. It was a tragedy and a terrible legacy of empire. It is said at the time that there were trains arriving as people were escaping what was India into the new Pakistan. Train loads of people were arriving in Lahore, but those trains were packed with corpses by the time they reached the city of Lahore. About 6 or 7 years ago, I was in Lahore for a lecture in the University of the Punjab, and I was taken to some of the sites of massacre in the city at that time. And it was hugely difficult to simply get your head around and in any sense imagine the horror of what was going on. Lahore being close to the Indian border as they descended into this catastrophic killing field and violence as a result of the independence and partition of the Indian subcontinent. Now, you may remember that Pakistan was partitioned itself, and it was partitioned, creating a new country in 1973, and that new country was Bangladesh. And religious and political tensions remain in that subcontinent to this day. Pakistan and India are a constant threat to each other. There are nuclear weapons involved on both sides. There are still huge tensions. There are still outbreaks of violence and war over Kashmir. And 1947 until now, religious nationalism, religious sectarianism has not gone away, and the tensions remain in that part of the world, all part of the legacy of empire. Well, we'll go into rooms. Loretto will allocate us to rooms, and there is a question. It will appear in the chat. How would you describe the role of the British Empire in India? Remember, India was seen as the jewel in the crown. How would you describe the role of the British Empire in India? Why did Indians resist the empire? And perhaps a bigger question, could independence have avoided all that tragedy of bloodshed and partition? Okay, Loretto, thank you. We take 20 minutes. Okay, I take it we're back from, or back with our coffee or whatever. Final bit of exploration this evening is Suez, where the sun finally set, and perhaps we are within the memory range now of most of us, or many of us. My first awareness, I suppose, of international politics was in 1956. And at home in those days, we had a wet battery wireless. That's what we called it. It was known at the time. And at 1 p.m. and 6 p.m., the wireless was turned on for the BBC News. Now, it may seem strange that a kid should listen to news so intently, but it seems I did. Or if I was playing at games or playing toys, I was, maybe as children do, somehow absorbing what was coming out of that wet battery wireless. It was dominated by the Suez Crisis and the Budapest Rising and Russian response. Now, I've not forgotten those two crises, and the international awareness of then remains more vivid than the IRA border campaign, which was taking place at the same time. I really have very little memory of that, but I do remember Suez and Budapest. There was a larger world, it seems, out there in which terrible things were happening. I didn't know it then, too young to know, but this was the world of empire. The Western imperial power or world of Britain and France, and the Eastern Empire of Soviet Russia. And still less did I realize that the British Empire, into which I had been born, and which had shaped the lives of my parents, and of which I was a beneficiary, it was in fact coming to an end in Egypt. I was probably aware of the empire in which the sun never set. I was growing up in a village where social and religious life was dominated by church, And at evening service in that village, as kids, by the way, we went to church twice on Sunday, plus Sunday school. It was quite a religious upbringing. Well, we often sang an evening hymn in which there was a line, "And earth's proud empires pass away." Well, I didn't know it, but that was what was happening to one of Earth's proudest empires in 1956. The sun did set, and I've never forgotten that not so innocent evening hymn. The church, of course, largely was pro-empire, but it did not realize that some of its sung piety was so subversive, and at least one kid was not only listening to the world news, but absorbing what he sang in church. Well, the French had built the Suez Canal in 1869, and they opened it with the party of all parties. Royal yachts apparently blocked the harbours of Alexandria and Port Said. Empress Eugenie of France was there, the Emperor Franz Joseph of Austria-Hungary, princes from Prussia and Russia and the Netherlands, along with thousands of European and Eastern high society personalities, all indulged in global party time. The canal was a vital waterway, opening a much shorter route from the west to the east, something the British Empire, with its jewel in India, welcomed. Alex von Tunselman, in her book Blood and Sand, Suez, Hungary and the Crisis That Shook the World, she says that, like many good parties, Egypt's opening of the Suez Canal was followed by a long and unpleasant hangover. Well, Egypt had great hopes of wealth from the canal, but Britain, reaching its height as an imperial power, wanted to control things. And up to 1914, Britain had accounted for more than half of the canal's traffic. But France, too, wanted a say. Until 1867, Egypt was a province of the Ottoman Empire when a degree of independence was granted and the monarch of Egypt was upgraded. Disraeli was the British Prime Minister. He wanted the Egyptian monarch's 44% share in the canal. Now, in 1875, the shares went up for sale, but the British Parliament was not in session. So Disraeli borrowed £4 million, in today's money, 4.75 billion, from the banker Lord Rothschild. And in 1882, British forces invaded Alexandria and Port Said, and from 1882, Britain treated Egypt as a protectorate, pulled all the levers of power, and treated the canal as their property. Later, oil became central to control, and while World War I claimed millions of lives, oil provided an unmatched opportunity for profit. And so the British and the French moved into the later British creation of Iraq, to Mosul. Suez was crucial, and the British were dominating the controlled stakes. In 1922, Britain gave Egypt theoretical independence while reserving direct control over communications, defence, the protection of foreign interests and minorities, and the administration of the Sudan. The canal was garrisoned by British troops. In 1936, a British-Egyptian treaty was negotiated by Foreign Secretary Anthony Eden, and British troop numbers were reduced to 10,000. Egypt may have looked more independent, but Britain was still in control. Now, all empires faced resistance. The British Empire was no exception. It had happened in Ireland and India, and now also it was happening in Egypt. A young Colonel Nasser was coming to prominence, and he told the Americans that Egyptian resentments were really against their own superior officers, other Arabs, the British and the Israelis in that order. Conflict had erupted in 1952. British soldiers and Egyptians died. The 1936 treaty, agreed by Anthony Eden, was abrogated, meaning that Britain's claim to Suez was no longer legitimate. The British response to that was to pour 80,000 troops into the canal region. The Suez Canal was about oil and power and global power, and Britain was not going to let go of any of these. In April 1955, Eden became Prime Minister, and he set out on a disastrous strategy on Egypt. Nasser had overthrown a weak Egyptian government in 1952 and was attracting many of a younger generation of Egyptians by his anti-imperial stance. So in 1956, Nasser annexed the Suez Canal. Eden, with the French and Israelis, met in a series of secret meetings and hatched a plan. The Israelis would attack and invade Egypt, which would then give the British and the French the excuse to step in as peace brokers and in effect take control of the Suez Canal. It happened according to plan. Britain and France invaded Egypt, but the Americans, fearing that Egypt would be pushed into the Soviet camp, refused to support the British and the French. In effect, the Americans pulled the rug from under the British and the French, stunning the British in particular. The failed invasion had begun on the 29th of October 1956, and on the 5th of November, the Soviets invaded Hungary to crush a Hungarian revolt against Soviet imperialism. The British withdrew from Egypt, humiliated. It was the end of empire. The imperial presence in Egypt since 1882 was no more. The empire on which the sun never set now realized, or if it did not, the international order knew that the sun had finally set. Between Suez and Budapest, something had happened. Two historians put it this way: the two crises of 1956 brought into view imperial power in a crude form, severely undermined in one case, harshly coercive, but with diminishing moral authority on the other. The colonial powers of Western Europe, mainly Britain and France, had lost their coercive capacity and political authority, and the probability of a new international order opened up in 1956. But there was also the reality of what became the Cold War, as two big powers began to dominate. The United States and the Soviet Union would dominate and threaten the world order. Eisenhower's refusal to let Britain and France win at Suez shifted the balance of power globally. Now, Britain did not have to go along with everything the Americans wanted, as it would demonstrate during the Vietnam War. But Washington could and might slap it down at any time if it thought it was getting too big. The whole world saw that former colonial subjects could overtake their former colonial masters. During World War II, when the term superpower was coined to describe states that could exert extraordinary power on a global scale, there were considered to be three of them: the United States, the Soviet Union, and the British Empire. As von Tunzelmann said, now there were two. Okay, we can open that up into a little bit of discussion, a plenary discussion. Why did the crisis of you might want to look at why the crisis of 1956 caused the sun to finally set in the British Empire, and ask, well, has that ever really been acknowledged? Or is there still a fantasy game or a game of nostalgia being played out? The same could apply to the French Empire as well. It had finally gone by 1962.